South Africa's African National Congress seeks to form a national unity government, but will the country's other major parties get on board? Hello, I'm Naidu, and this is The Heat. On Thursday, senior officials with the African National Congress held a critical meeting in Johannesburg to discuss post-election steps after losing their parliamentary majority for the first time in 30 years. South African President Cyril Ramaphosa announced his party's plan.
We have therefore agreed that we will invite political parties to form a government of national unity as the best option to move our country forward. The modalities of the government of national unity will take into account the conditions prevailing at this moment in our country's history. The purpose of the government of national unity must be first and foremost to tackle the pressing issues that South Africans want to be addressed.
The ANC has a constitutional deadline to finalize the plan so Parliament can convene and elect a new president by June 16th. Will it be able to form a new government by then, or are there political challenges that lie ahead? Well, let's bring in our panel to discuss this and more. Joining us from Johannesburg, Nhlanhla Sehume is a journalist and news anchor in South Africa. From Cape Town, we're joined by Sanusha Naidu, who is a senior research associate based with the Institute for Global Dialogue. And here in Washington, D.C., Abdullahi Boru Halakhe is an Africa security and policy analyst. Welcome to all of you. Sanusha, let me start with you. Well, the dust has settled. We now have a much clearer picture of the political landscape in South Africa. The ANC took a beating, but we also saw the emergence of a new political force in South Africa. That is the MK party, which is led by the former president, Jacob Zuma. So, what do you see ahead? What do you see unfolding in the days ahead?
Good day to you, Anand, as well as to my fellow panelists. I think it still hasn't really settled the dust, because we still have to think about what this government of national unity that was articulated last night by President Ramaphosa, what does it entail in terms of modalities? Today we see that there have been certain political parties who haven't really come to accept that or try to say that they're going to be part of it. There's been a bit of toing and froing on that. And I think with the Mkhonto Sizwe party, which is called the MK party, essentially, they have been one of those parties that have said that they have some very, very non-negotiable instruments, and that one of those non-negotiable instruments in talking to the ANC would be that President Ramaphosa must no longer be there as head of the party. But that has also been a bit of a reaction to the tension between former President Zuma and, of course, Ramaphosa. But I think the days ahead will see that obviously, June 16th is a holiday, as well as June 17th, because the Youth Day falls on a Sunday, so the Monday will become a holiday. We're looking at June 18th for the first sitting of Parliament. So if we work backwards from there, we'll have to see how that works out for the ANC and in getting these partners on board. Right now, I think everything still remains very tense. There's still a lot of discussion about what kind of engagement will happen. The ANC has opened up the discussion with all 18 parties, including itself, that will be represented in Parliament according to the final election results that were presented to the Chief Justice yesterday, and then, of course, to the candidate list to the Secretary of Parliament. But I think what is really critical here is what the discussion is going to be between the MK party and the ANC, because whilst they've been almost very rigid in the fact that they have these demands, they've also said they're open-minded. So I think that's a question in terms of whether there's going to be some level of like-mindedness within the two parties. And of course, there's also the question here about to what extent the MK party will also have to think about its own ruling, because it won KZN, where it did very well, but it didn't win a majority. So it has to think about a coalition in the province of KwaZulu-Natal.
Right, and does the MK party, which got just over 14% of the votes, Sanusha, does it bring any firm policy proposals to the table on charting the way forward for South Africa?
Well, I think they kind of broadly define and characterize their policy proposals around the kind of radical economic transformation agenda, which again talks about the constitution is a very key element which they feel doesn't necessarily create the kind of transformation agenda that should be inclusive of all South Africans, particularly the majority of South Africans that have been marginalized or have been affected and impacted by apartheid. But they also talk about the idea of who controls the economy, and they're very, very vocal about this idea of an anti-white monopoly capital approach. So these are some of the dynamics that we see. But I think what was said yesterday by President Ramaphosa about what will be the principles, standards, procedures, and norms that will inform these discussions is around the Constitution and the principles of the Constitution. So I think there we're going to see perhaps whether there'll be some moderating and tempering of that position. But for right now, I think that the MK party will stick to what it sees as its own kind of broad policy perspective, and of course how that goes forward.
And Nhlanhla, as I said, you know, the MK party got just over 14% of the vote. I mean, to what do you attribute their success? It was largely in one part of the country, in the eastern province of KwaZulu-Natal. But what was the attraction?
And quite plainly, I think it is the Zuma effect, or former President Jacob Zuma being the face of the campaign of the MK party. So what we saw there, yes, this is a party that's still relatively old, only registered in December of last year, but months ahead, or 5 months ahead, we've seen a lot of movement around this party when it comes to their campaign effort. Of course, as mentioned, Zuma being the face of the party. So even as you drive around the country that is South Africa, crisscrossing the country, you would see placards or even posters of the former President Jacob Zuma, who then was officially their face for this campaign for the elections. But very interesting, Anand, is that even in the way that the party has conducted itself, there was a lot of internal fighting, which also played out quite interestingly in court this week, where Jabulani Khumalo, who claims to lead the party but was expelled quite recently, he challenged this decision in the electoral court to say that he is still the leader of the MK party and not former President Jacob Zuma. But very interestingly is that former President Jacob Zuma also addressed his supporters outside court, labeling Mr. Khumalo a liar, also saying that he has no case when it comes to what he's trying to prove in court, and that when the time comes for their members to go to parliament, definitely Mr. Khumalo won't be one of them.
Right, and in fact, like, given the depth of the ideological and political differences between these parties, I mean, is there going to be a quick resolution to this, to the formation of a coalition government, or are we going to see some tough negotiations? We're going to have to see all parties make some major compromises.
And it is a moment for reflection for a number of these political parties. We, of course, did hear from the ANC that came out of the blocks last night after those marathon meetings of the party's highest decision-making body, that is their National Executive Committee, having met over the past couple of days to discuss what proposals the party wishes to put forward to South Africans when it comes to what we've learned to be the formulation of this government of national unity. So, like some analysts have described it, for the ANC, it seems to be an invite to other political parties to join their cause, if you will, to have this kumbaya moment. Yeah. But unfortunately, when it comes to policies of or manifestos delivered by a number of these political parties, notably the EFF, for instance, that says that they won't be negotiating with a racist party, one only wonders, although we do have our suspicions as to who they are referring to. And the MK party, very interestingly, saying that, like Sanusha just mentioned, that if the ANC plans to have President Cyril Ramaphosa as their candidate for president, they simply are not interested in getting involved in these negotiations. But saying, very interestingly, Zuma, over the past couple of days, saying that he's open to discussions, that he has hosted quite a number of interviews at his Nhlanhla homestead, speaking to journalists, saying that, look, they are willing to speak to the ANC and, in his words, save the ANC.
Abdullahi, any new coalition that emerges from this will have its work cut out. The South African economy is struggling. Unemployment is extremely high, especially among young people, and the country is still beset by widespread corruption as well as crime. I mean, after 30 years in power, the ANC has not been able to deliver on these issues. So how do you see what happens next?
I think for ANC, not just for ANC, but for the South Africa, this is a moment, like my colleague said, is a moment of reflection. 30 years is a very long time in politics, and majority of post-independence African political parties, majority of them are defeated, and the ones that have not been defeated are really anemic. I mean, the closest we have to one of the few that are remaining is the CCM in Tanzania. But this should again be an opportunity for renewal for South Africa. I don't see it being an existential crisis, because not just for the ANC and South Africa, because a lot of the time the conversation is, oh no, look, after 30 years, ANC has lost its majority. It is okay in the sense that ANC has not delivered. But to be very careful, the antidote to this cannot be populism. And that is why being in a coalition with all its problems, it will be an opportunity for pragmatism and governance and delivery, rather than, theater and populism that doesn't have any bearing at the end of the day. But it's very rich. I mean, for Zuma and, the way I look at it, this is just ANC A, ANC B, ANC C. For people to blame ANC for failing to deliver and then vote for Zuma, who was in power for almost 10 years, and that period is almost considered as a lost decade, also provides an opportunity for ANC to reflect that people are not necessarily supporting other parties. It's just that they are frustrated that ANC is not delivering.
That's an interesting observation you make there, Abdullahi, about the post-colonial liberation movements or political parties' independence. We've seen the same, you mentioned Tanzania, we've seen the same in Zambia as well. They normally have a lifespan of just about 2 decades, don't they? Are we seeing the same thing in South Africa?
Precisely, because I think there is a general tendency, because of how significant the South African moment after the end of apartheid for many people, for people of a certain generation, that is a touchstone. That is the North Star that they refer to every time they think about the continent. But then at the same time, when reality sets in, we have to be able to say to South Africans, look, you are not exceptional. What has happened to ANC could happen to any other parties, and it has happened. And again, the personal drama of personalities that are involved, which shouldn't cloud us from really making a very clear-eyed decision. Finally, I think it's not just ANC's failure to deliver, but also it's just a generational question. If you look at over the last couple of years of successive elections, ANC was shading voters at the rate of 3 or 4% across various elections. But also, if you look at the demography, the number of people who are born after the end of apartheid, that number is going up. They don't have a great deal of muscle memory of what apartheid did to them, apart from learning from their parents and school and popular culture. For them, this is the normal, and for ANC, it needs to reflect that in the way they deliver, failure of which they are going to lose more votes in the coming elections.
Sanusha, what's been the response from the Democratic Alliance? That's the party that got just over 21% of the vote. It's a market-oriented party, and according to some reports, it wants to dismantle some of the ANC policies that favor more black participation in the economy, things like a policy called BEE, Black Economic Empowerment. Where do they feature in this?
Well, the Democratic Alliance has made its own position very clear before the election. I mean, one of the things we've got to also bear in mind is that the Democratic Alliance was part of a multi-party charter, which was really a group of opposition parties that came together, which was famously called the Moonshot Pact by its leader, John Steenhuisen. But then, of course, the name changed because it needed to be much more than just this kind of articulate or this kind of framing. But it was really about that and how they would come together as a kind of united opposition and move forward in terms of what would be their showing at the polls. Well, now that that multi-party charter seems to have unraveled itself, one of the members of that party of the Charter Action SA, led by Herman Mashaba, feels that they've been betrayed by the DA because the DA is open to the discussion with the ANC. The DA actually has a few of its own red lines as well, and one of it is this question about the Deputy President of the ANC and of the Republic, Paul Mashatile. I mean, they've been also very vocal about him and his engagements in issues of malfeasance and corruption and so forth, and so they don't want him there. It's part of the rhetoric. They also have particular views about, as you say, black economic empowerment, but I think it's more linked to the idea as well of what the ANC has as what we call cadre deployment, which they say is a no-go for them at the start. They want to keep the independence of the Reserve Bank, and that's something that has been in terms hotly debated by parties like the Economic Freedom Fighters. And then, of course, they also want to be able to have a bigger kind of role. The speculation is they want to have a bigger kind of role in the context of the parliament and the oversight. So these are some of the challenges that they have. But I think what the problem is as well is that they have also kind of come out to say that if there's talks with the EFF, they don't want to be part of it as well. Right now, we're having a lot of speculation in the public domain, which is the optics of what the parties have been doing in the run-up to this election with their campaigning and how they've been campaigning. The question we have to ask ourselves is whether this kind of view and what they are projecting in the public domain as the optic, will it continue, or will they actually start to think about what it means? Because this is an election that not just the ANC came in terms of it losing its majority. I think it was no party that got a majority. And that's something that these parties have to start becoming much more conducive to, as opposed to putting these blur lines out there.
Nhlanhla, this was an election which was contested by something like 50 parties, I think. There were also independents who were allowed to run. So, Nhlanhla, what about the smaller parties? And I'm thinking about those parties that are outside what I guess we could call the big four, you know, the big four being the ANC, the Democratic Alliance, the MK party, as well as the Economic Freedom Fighters. I mean, those smaller parties outside of those four make up about just over 13% of the vote. Is there a role for them?
Well, there certainly is, Anand, especially regarding what we've heard from some of these smaller parties or even independents. I'll make an example of Analyst, who was contesting these elections as an independent candidate. She held a media briefing earlier on today in Killarney, where she had said that she's been receiving very interesting calls from what she calls some of the bigger political parties that want to invite them to talks around coalitions or even partnering as we look forward to this seventh administration. So it would seem to me that despite a poor showing by some of the smaller political parties, there is space for them, especially in the configuration of this new administration that will make up our government going forward.
Abdullahi, the Economic Freedom Fighters, known as the EFF, led by the very mercurial Julius Malema, they have been for a long time taking up a lot of the oxygen, the political oxygen in South Africa, but it's a party that calls for very radical economic reforms. And if we look at the MK party, for instance, they want changes to the constitution. So it's going to have to be a time now in South Africa for consensus building and for parties to put the national interest above their own interests. Do you see that happen?
It's not if the parties want, it's just the situation demands, because none of these parties can rule on their own. Not all of them, for purposes of brinksmanship at the moment, they can set up the bar for pure brinksmanship, that this is what our demands or our red lines are. But the reality is, like many other African countries, and I've always reckoned that, you know, the South African exception is a function of a specific time, that there's a fair degree of fracture and a function of, you know, a state not, you know, meeting the significant amount of demands that are placed on it. But I think at the same time, populism will have to give in to real pragmatism of governance and doing the basics of the states. And this includes the employment numbers that we know South Africa has significant numbers. You know, you have load shedding, but at the same time, this is, what maybe, people from outside who are looking at South Africa are maybe wish casting. That South Africa is playing other important role. They have sent their forces to Mozambique. They have sent their forces to the eastern part of the Democratic Republic of Congo. They've taken Israel to the International Court of Justice. So there is a lot for South Africa, but all that could be lost if the parties fail to take advantage and meet the moment like they did in the early 90s, because this is an opportunity. A win for South Africa is a win for Africa and beyond.
Right, and that reference you made to load shedding there, that's the rolling blackouts that we have seen in South Africa over the past few years. Sanusha, there have been some calls for a coalition to be, quote, investor friendly, but there are prominent voices in South Africa, and one of them is the former public prosecutor, Thuli Madonsela, who's warning against that. The thing is that South Africa will need a vast amount of investment in the future to create jobs and to lift its economy, to see that economy grow.
Yeah, I think the former public protector, Advocate Madonsela, has been very vocal on this. In fact, she's raising the question as the market as one variable in this equation around the government of national unity, or the way in which that kind of governing arrangement is constructed and designed. But I think what's also important is that within the country as well, there are those economic stakeholders, economic actors who are looking at this very cautiously. Some see this as the GNU being a possible way in which you create a stable government in the next couple of days, and then of course move forward. But remember that it's going to be a work in progress, and I think it's going to be a constant running on the treadmill here for any kind of power sharing or any kind of governing arrangement that is going to go forward from here when Parliament sits for the first time on possibly 18th of June, because then you got to know that this is going to be about what markets going to think about, and it flags back to the issues around the economy, around issues around the economic architecture, the design of where we are, and the fact that we are suffering from serious economic malaise in terms of our growth trajectory, our data, our unemployment crisis, especially amongst those that were born after 94, but also those that were born in the late 1990s and early 2000, because they are the ones that really are the economic active population that's not seeing the kind of job creation and the economic activity that they would like to be part of. So I think all of the parties have to actually have brinkmanship right now, because you can go into these negotiations on the idea that you're going to have these red lines, but at the end of the day, we have an election coming up in 2026, which is a local government election where we vote for mayors and who to rule our local municipalities. But in the interim between that and now, between now and then, you also have by-elections where there are vacancies at the most basic local government level, and so those can also be a benchmark for how people are feeling. Is because as the political parties get into this kind of discussion of negotiations, I think they want to assert themselves in a very authoritative way that I have more power than you. This is not what this is about. This is about the fact that the people of South Africa, over 16 million, came out and voted and said, we're not giving any one of you a majority.
Nhlanhla, Sanusha mentioned that number there, just over 16 million people who went to the polls, 16.2 million. That's the lowest voter turnout in 3 decades in South Africa. There was deep unhappiness. There were complaints against the rule of President Cyril Ramaphosa. One analyst, Lukhona Mnguni, described it this way. Let's listen to him.
Ramaphosa was seen as a turning point, the person who would fix the country, the person who would deal with state capture, the person who would actually, recenter governance, and of course deal with load shedding, power blackouts at the time, only for things to go completely wrong within his term.
So, Nhlanhla, what are your thoughts? Did these factors contribute to the lower turnout? What about young people in South Africa? Did they come out to vote?
Unfortunately not, Anand. And this goes polar opposite to what most South Africans viewed around the country when they noticed or realized that the queues seemed very long in some parts of the country. But as we'd come to discover that these queues or these long lines that we saw were because of what voters alleged to be inefficiencies on the part of the IEC, for instance. But to go back to the point that's being made by my colleague Lukhona Mnguni, it would seem that a lot of South Africans, especially young South Africans, are disenchanted with the ruling government, and some saying that it is a ruling, or the ANC is a party of really empty promises from what they've seen during their tenure as a ruling government in this particular country. When you look at the unemployment rate, still staggeringly high, especially amongst the youth. So it comes as no surprise that many of the young people in this country decided to take the public holiday and stay home because they felt that really they've got nothing to benefit, especially judging by the track record of the ruling party over the past couple of years.
Sanusha, the British newspaper, the Financial Times, which is very influential, says South Africa would experience an economic implosion if the ANC formed a coalition with the MK party as one of its partners. It is not surprisingly calling for a coalition with the Democratic Alliance, but South Africa has a pretty big, significant and powerful business community, which is mostly white. How are they responding to the outcome of this election?
Well, I think they're also being very cautious right now. And I think what the Financial Times has created is it's also created a lot of hype in international markets about us, about the economy. And I think that is what Advocate Madosela was referring to, is which market are you referring to? Which market is going to actually create the jobs in South Africa? Because there is a sense that the market kind of gets into this very kind of effervescent negative trend. We saw a little bit on that when it came to our currency and touching around 19 Rand to the dollar. But I think what is important right now is that what you have to think about is internally, we got to look at other stuff. We got to look at, for example, our internal, as you rightly point out, our internal economic actors, our investors, our what you call this, the JSC and so forth. And internally, I think there's a sense of what Razia Khan from Standard Chartered said not so long ago. She said that we have to be cautious in terms of where the market is, but we also have to be cautious in terms of we're just in a very, very uncharted new territory for us in terms of what the next kind of GNU will look like, the Government of National Unity. And right now, I think that the posturing is creating a little bit more nervousness in the market. Internally, investment companies, insurance companies are also thinking about how that will impact on fiscal stability, pension funds, and also the macroeconomic stability. So if indeed the EFF and the ANC go into some kind of, the EFF goes into a GNU and of course have this kind of relationship, I think markets will kind of get very hyper in the initial period and they'll settle down. We've had this before.
Abdullahi, I've only got about 30 seconds left, but if we look at this election, I mean, no matter the challenges, the enormous challenges that South Africa faces, I think it'd be fair to say that the democratic process has worked, hasn't it, in South Africa? I mean, almost everyone, with the notable exception of the MK party, has accepted the outcome.
Absolutely. And, you know, this is not a norm in many African countries where election is a matter of death and life. So I think the institutions, the political parties, South Africans deserve an enormous amount of credit. Right. It is a testament to that we are sitting here and discussing the GNU rather than the results of the elections, if somebody accepted or not. That is kudos to them. And it is, again, one more step that South Africans are taking towards entrenching democracy.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. Thank you to all of you for being with us. And that is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C.